Before you watch today's episode, we want to remind you that tickets are on sale for the Newsagents live shows with HSBC UK. We're kicking off our tour at the Birmingham Symphony Hall on February the 17th. Then we're off to the Bridgewater Hall in Manchester the following week on the 24th. And finally, the Usher Hall in Edinburgh on March the 11th. Head over to Global Player to get your tickets for any of these dates. The link will be in the description below. And we're very excited to see you there.
We lost the referendum vote, but Scotland can still carry the political initiative. Scotland can still emerge as the real winner. For me, as leader, my time is nearly over. But for Scotland, the campaign continues, and the dream shall never die.
That was the late Alex Salmond, the day after Scotland voted no to independence on the 19th of September 2014, a decade ago. And the question is, why are we playing you, Alex Salmond, making a speech about Scotland staying within the United Kingdom today? Well, it's because we're starting a brand new series here, gently, What If? It's counterfactual history, which allows us and you to just indulge the question of what might have been. What if Scotland had voted yes? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And we've got a whole series, a hamper, because it's nearly Christmas, a hamper full of what ifs that we're going to bring you over the coming days. But the question of Scotland is such a fascinating one because, well, if they had, would it be part of the European Union now? Would Britain have relocated its nuclear submarine bases? Would the King be the King of Scotland as well? I mean, these are the big questions that hung over.
So it's just worth reminding you kind of what happened in 2014 and the events in the run-up to it. Because, of course, the reason there was a referendum in September 2014 is because David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister in 2011, agreed to it. And he agreed to it because in the Holyrood elections of 2011, the SNP, Scottish National Party, did something that everyone thought was impossible. Indeed, the system was designed to be impossible, which was to achieve an outright majority in the Scottish Parliament, which has a largely, although not exclusively, proportional system, electoral system. They did that. It was kind of a bit of a quirk. They did so after having governed as a minority since 2007, and they get a majority. And of course, in their manifesto for that election is pledged, like it always is for the Scottish National Party, that they wanted an independence referendum. Cameron agreed. He thought it would be impossible to resist that demand for a referendum. He could have done it. There was no legal requirement that he had to do it. But he felt that if he said no, which I think was probably right, if he said no, if Westminster, having seen that result, was seen to be frustrating the will of the Scottish people, that the support for independence would only grow. And of course, in 2011 and 2012, when he signed the Edinburgh Agreement with Alex Salmond, which basically stipulated how the referendum would work, actually it didn't look like such a risky bet. Because at that time, as it had done for many decades, Scottish independence was still a pretty minority pursuit. You know, it was around 35% in the polls. So Cameron felt that he could accede to the referendum request and be reasonably confident, although it was still a gamble, that he would win on the other side.
This is the right decision for Scotland, but it's also right for the United Kingdom, that there is going to be one simple, straightforward question about whether Scotland wants to stay in the United Kingdom or separate itself from the United Kingdom. And that referendum has to be held before the end of 2014. I always wanted to show respect to the people of Scotland. They voted for a party that wanted to have a referendum. I've made that referendum possible and made sure that it's decisive, it is legal, and it's fair.
What's really interesting is the wording that was established, because originally the Edinburgh Agreement, I mean, a lot of work and thought goes into exactly how you ask the question and whether it tends to bias. And so the Scottish Government had originally said that their preferred question was, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? And the Electoral Commission tested the proposition and with other possible versions, and they found that do you agree made it a leading question, which would be more likely to garner a positive response. So it was then amended to should Scotland be an independent country. It seems very obvious now. Do you agree that tea is nicer than coffee? Do you agree that a biscuit's lovely to have with, an afternoon drink? Makes you think that you're meant to say yes. So they pulled it back. Should Scotland be an independent country? And what I remember about that period was the Monday before the referendum. The headlines came out. A poll in the Times said that it looked as if the yes were going to edge it. And the
first poll, the first time
it was the
that a
first
poll
poll,
had
it was
said
the first
that,
national poll.
51 reasons to be cheerful for Scotland's Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon on the campaign trail today. 51% support for a yes vote in the poll result that's got everyone talking.
We've always believed that we would see yes come up the outside lane and hopefully take the lead. So the campaign is going according to plan, but I'm a veteran of many election campaigns and I know that things can change very quickly. So we need to keep focused, keep our eyes.
I opened my emails to find out that I had been sent what was called a global itinerary, an air ticket. This is the first thing I knew. I'd been sent an air ticket to go to Edinburgh from Newsnight. Nobody had actually called me up and informed me. They were just like, oh, there's an air ticket, get on the plane, go to Edinburgh. And I was like, oh, OK, I guess this is quite an important story. And on that day, I interviewed Alex Salmond in the middle of the Market Square. And then I saw Nick Clegg, Anne Cameron, Ed Miliband. So the first thing you think is like, boy, you lot are terrified. It was the first indication that stuff wasn't going the way that Cameron thought it would, because all three of the Westminster leaders, they were like a pack, this sort of Westminster leaders trio, all there to make sure that Scotland did not vote yes.
So that's the lead up to it. We're not doing the what if here. What if they had voted yes? Because I think that then the questions are really extraordinary.
Well, it was 55-45, of course.
Yeah.
So you needed 5 percentage points, just over, to go the other way, which, I mean, it's a reasonable victory, but it's not inconceivable that it could have gone the other way. And indeed, yes, Alex Salmond said afterwards, Nicola Sturgeon said afterwards that, they felt that if the campaign had gone on another week, it could easily have done. They actually thought that poll, the Sunday Times poll, was actually quite counterproductive.
Of course.
Because it scared, as you say, Emily, it scared all the Westminster
Came
establishment.
just in time.
They delivered the so-called vow, which said we would have more devolution for the Scottish Parliament. So in the end, they thought it had just snatched away. But it is a fascinating counterfactual because it could easily have happened. What we would have been faced with as a result is something that we haven't really seen in certainly recent European history since the end of the Cold War, which is the breakup of a massive multinational union. A multinational union which has, in one form or another, existed for 3 centuries, in some ways even longer. And if you think Brexit was complicated, divorcing Britain from a 50-year, 45-year membership of an economic political community, which is somewhere between a state and a confederation, we would have not seen anything like it, because we would have been divorcing 300 years worth of common legal practice, common economic practice, and a single market which has existed for as long as the Act of Union has existed. It would have been astonishing, extraordinary, and incredibly difficult to achieve.
I'm going to say that if Scotland had voted yes, it might very well have saved the breakup of another union, which was the EU.
It would have done.
Because there was a moment at which, and this is so dependent on personality, so much of this stuff is, all politics is fundamentally personal. But there was a moment at which David Cameron had won the AV referendum, tick, and he'd won the Scotland referendum, tick, and he then went on to think, I can roll the dice 3 times. And I remember it was George Osborne saying, I'm not sure you want to do this. This is not how gambling works. You don't win twice and then go on to do the third one. If Cameron had lost Scotland, would he have been much, much more scared about taking another referendum on? I mean, you can't lose one referendum and then think the next one's going to be fine. I bet you we wouldn't have ever had that referendum.
And the other counterfactual in all of that is, what if they have voted to leave the United Kingdom, but they wanted to join the European Union? Would the European Union then have welcomed them in?
No.
Well, because of Spain. because
And others
who
can't have
felt
separatists.
You can't have separatists breaking up countries and sort of balkanising. And Lewis, your point about, since the Cold War, I mean, I suppose the only recent historical example, and it's not a great one, is Yugoslavia
And Czechoslovakia.
Well, Kosovo,
and well, Czechoslovakia was sort of slightly easier with Czechia now and Slovakia, but Yugoslavia was ugly when that
Kosovo's
broke
a
up
new
in the
country,
90s.
and I mean Kosovo is still now what is it, 15 years on, still waiting to have accession to the EU. So these things take a long time. But there is no way that Scotland would have just walked up the front of the queue, I don't think, on that one.
No, and none of these countries had a global empire and were the sort of state that has influenced world events in the way that Britain had done. And I think that the EU, I think this is one of the most tantalising, interesting parts of this particular counterfactual, right? Because I think there is absolutely a timeline that you can see, which is that we would now be sitting in a situation, maybe not now, maybe Scotland would have by now rejoined as an independent nation, but certainly for some time.
It wouldn't have been even a rejoin. It would have been a join,
joining, yes,
right?
But that England would have, and England and Wales, rump UK, our UK, let's call it that, and there would have been loads of questions about what it meant for Wales and Northern Ireland, but whatever was left of the UK would have remained in the EU, because for a start, what we can, I think, definitely say is that Cameron would have resigned. Cameron would have resigned. If he had lost the referendum, it wouldn't have been Salmond who would have resigned. Cameron would have resigned. Cameron could not possibly have stayed on. As we saw, he resigned over Brexit. But to oversee the dissolution of your own state, it would have been crushing. Yeah. It would have destroyed his authority. So his government would have fallen. And as a result, although he had already pledged to have an EU referendum by that point in 2014, he promised it in January 2012, but I think it would have been impossible to imagine that a government which was overseeing, because what would have had to happen next is there would have had to have been intense negotiations between the remainder of the UK government, the Westminster government, whoever had taken over in those circumstances, who knows, maybe it had been William Hague, George Osborne, whoever.
Well,
and the
Nick
Scottish...
Clegg was actually the Deputy Prime Minister. Does Deputy Prime Minister mean that you would then become the Prime Minister?
Acting Prime Minister, yes.
Yeah, until the Conservatives had elected someone. I mean, who knows what would have happened to that coalition government. But then there would have had to have been a negotiation, as we saw with the UK and the EU, but on a much bigger scale, between the incoming Scottish government, which would have still been in the UK until it left, and Westminster. And it feels impossible to me to imagine a situation in which, whilst that was going on, we would have had another referendum, which was asking whether what was left of the UK should leave the EU and start those negotiations. So I think in that timeline, weirdly enough, England stays in the EU and Scotland probably doesn't, because the EU had made clear that Scotland would be kicked out, at least for a while.
We've got a very Anglo-centric view of the referendum. I guess the other point is, if you're north of the border, then Alex Salmond becomes your de facto Prime Minister. So there is probably no Nicola Sturgeon succession of the kind that we've had. No.
He would have been triumphant.
He and his obituary, which obviously we have just written because it was 2 months ago, would have been entirely different. The man who had liberated Scotland.
So my other question is let's just run this through.
Yeah.
This was in 2014. We're now 10 years on from that. Would Scotland 10 years on be thinking,
can we rejoin?
Exactly. Yeah. That's my question. Would they be thinking what a lot of people in Britain are now thinking about the European Union, thinking, well, it seemed a bloody good idea at the time, but it's made life very, very complicated for us now that we're outside of the European Union. And I just wonder whether there was a possibility that in Scotland, with all the upheaval that it brought about, if there was a collapse in the oil price and suddenly Scottish revenues are nothing like as robust as they might have seemed when they were sort of setting out the plans for.
Quite nice to be sitting on those oil fields when Ukraine's just been invaded by Putin.
Yeah. Would the Scottish people be thinking, as a lot of the British people are now thinking, why did we do that?
Well, I suppose it would have depended, much like with Brexit, as to exactly what the settlement was and whether the incoming newly sovereign Scottish government, headed by Salmond, had been able to negotiate a deal which looked proximate to what he promised, i.e. that there would be no land border between Scotland and England, although if England had stayed in the EU, we saw all these arguments rehearsed with Brexit.
It's exactly the same.
It would have been exactly the same
as the Northern Ireland.
So how that could have stayed in, and that would have brought the EU in onto that territorial question, what would have happened to the currency, whether they'd have been able to retain sterling or not. Again, that was that was the winning argument in the end of the referendum. That's the thing that Alistair Darling and the No campaign pressed again and again and again. If you remember in the debates at that time, what currency would Scotland use? It would have depended whether they would have been able to stay in the EU as Salmond promised they would be. So I suspect the question of how Scots felt about it in the years afterwards, exactly as has happened to Britain with Brexit, though these dynamics are very similar in lots of ways because they're both breaking up of established political unions, would have depended on exactly what the deal was.
I would say that it might have been the last referendum in which, I mean, you could say that the yesers were the heart people and the knowers were the mind people. Do you remember that was the sort of the divide? And I can imagine a
heart overhead.
Leavers, Remainers turning into a naysayers and yesers. But I would say it wasn't, from what I remember, a referendum campaign mired in, I mean, it did get quite ugly at times, but it wasn't mired in misinformation. And that, I think, is...
This is exactly the point I wanted to make.
Quite toxic sometimes.
Well, no,
it was,
yes.
It was angry and it was passionate.
But you look at the detail.
Yeah.
I tell you what, the Brexiteers learnt from the SNP, which was the SNP put a ton of detailed information
don't spell things out.
and spelt it out absolutely clearly how independence would need to work.
We'll do that
Oil
with the
needs to be $130 a barrel on that basis when we be able to do it.
We're not going to tell you anything.
And the Brexiteers thought, screw that.
Yeah.
I'm not putting any information detail
on
in.
paper.
We're just going to put it down and say we'll be better off.
100%.
I mean, it is the fascinating thing about this counterfactual, right, is that unlike some of the others, you can definitely say that our entire political history that we've experienced for the last 10 years, which has been volatile, tumultuous, whatever, would have been, in British terms anyway, completely different. completely different. Because you don't get the 2015 general election in the way the dynamics that worked out with, the SNP winning 56 out of 59 seats and all of the effect that had. I mean, we would have had to probably have a general election while Scotland was still leaving the Union, which would have been weird and bizarre. You probably don't get Corbyn, you don't get Brexit.
It rewrites the electoral map of England.
It rewrites the electoral map. And who knows how England would have responded, what the feeling and sentiment within the Anglo-Scottish Union and within the sort of politics of these islands, how that would have sat, how Wales, which is suddenly already feels like it is relatively powerless within the Union, but at least has some counterbalance to England in the form of Scotland, how that works out, how it works out in terms of the politics of Northern Ireland. It would have completely transformed the kind of alchemy, the kind of balance of power within these islands.
Imagine the map. Like our map would look so weird, just angles, right? Basically a triangle.
It was a genuine pivot point. And you can understand why Cameron afterwards has said, and I think you can understand why he said this, that whilst Brexit was obviously devastating for his political career and he thought it was wrong, it paled in comparison to how it would have been with Scotland. Like if he had to choose one to win and one to lose.
But naive not to think that the two were absolutely interlinked.
Very much so. And we should also say, of course, as well, that it is not, despite the fact that the SNP have retreated, it is not a dead issue. As ever with referendums, as we've seen, it rarely actually settles the question.
Anything.
What it did, for sure, is it transformed the politics of Scotland on a but a largely constitutional basis. Scottish politics is still largely charted on yes or no. And whilst there is no prospect at the moment of that being litigated again, all you would need again is another SNP majority, or you would need a resurgence in that question. We know what it did to particularly young Scots, and the fact that the demographics are such that young Scots are far more in favour of it. It was older Scots who saved the Union. This is still a live question, and one which you just get the feeling, even more than Brexit maybe, you just get the feeling will be revisited again at some point, that the Union is safe for now, but not necessarily in perpetuity.
And thank you, Fiona Viglione, for sending us that question of what if Scotland had voted yes. In a moment, what if Rupert Murdoch hadn't bought the Sun newspaper? Well, thank you, Phil Harrison, for this one, which is what if Murdoch had never bought the Sun? And Murdoch bought the News of the World in '68, and then the Sun, I think, the following year, turns it into a tabloid format. But arguably, that's not when the Sun kind of became the sort of really influential. It was the tie-in between Thatcher and Murdoch. And Thatcher and Murdoch using anti-trade union legislation to completely transform the way the newspaper industry worked in this country. Because until then, it had been the old-fashioned print works who are kind of, that owed more to Caxton and the printing machines of the medieval Middle Ages than it did to the modern day.
Whopping was the word, wasn't it?
Whopping. And Wapping was the kind of this new factory that was built for getting newspapers out fast.
Moving from Fleet Street.
Fleet Street. And I remember as a young reporter being on the picket lines when the horses, police horses, would come charging out of Wapping, which would herald the lorries trying to move out to distribute the newspapers and
to
the
push
print
the
workers,
protesters away.
and to the SOGAT, the NGA, Brenda Dean, all these people from back in the day who were protesting. And it was the case.
And the print unions were incredibly, it's hard for us to imagine now, but they were incredibly powerful.
And a lot of the members were incredibly rich because they barely had to do any work to make an awful lot of money, and they held the newspapers to ransom.
They could stop production very, very easily.
And it was the case that on Wapping, on the highway at Wapping, which is where the Sun print works were, you'd see in the back streets kind of Maseratis and Ferraris that had been driven by some of the print workers who had obviously made a fortune, but were obviously, understandably, trying to defend their way of life at a time when new technology had transformed the industry. And that was the start of the marriage between the Sun and the Thatcher government that went on and on.
So the question that has been asked is, what if he hadn't bought it? And I love this phrase by writer Patrick Brogan, who said the pre-Murdoch Sun was a worthy, boring, leftish, popular broadsheet. In other words,
Daily Herald, isn't it?
everything it isn't now. And it was Robert Maxwell who originally thought, what if I buy the Sun? He saw that Murdoch had bought the News of the World, and he thought his opportunity was to come in and buy the Sun, split them up. Never happened, and obviously he got both. And from that point onwards, the Sun essentially became the first modern tabloid, right?
Yeah, it's hard to, I think, imagine now just kind of how revolutionary it was at the time, in the sense that, up to then, the biggest newspaper in Britain had been the Daily Mirror, and that was sort of, tabloid is the wrong word. It wasn't broadsheet. It wasn't sort of very, very sort of pompous in all of that kind of way, in that very traditional way. But it was the owners at the time, and the feeling was there was a feeling that it was still quite sort of patrician. And Murdoch felt that papers like this were talking down to people. He felt that there was a space to be for a more demotic, more fun-loving kind of newspaper, something that was kind of very much geared towards what people actually were interested in, rather than what they ought to know about, in that kind of classic, kind of slightly more educational sort of journalistic way. And then he buys The Sun, and he does make it raucous, and he makes it different, and he makes it something that in the end overtook the Mirror, which at that time would have seemed unimaginable, to become Britain's biggest daily newspaper, selling millions and millions and millions of copies. And also hard to imagine, John, or maybe it's probably not hard for you to imagine because you remember, but like just how powerful it was, right? Or how powerful it felt.
Oh,
Do you know how much he paid for it?
Was it £1 or something?
£800,000. And he later remarked, "I'm constantly amazed at the ease with which I've entered British newspapers." I mean, isn't that the thing? That nobody even made it that difficult for him. He promised fewer redundancies. The unions loved it. Come on in.
you see, the transformation. I mean, so some of it is about the power of trade unions and the Thatcher government. I mean, there was a guy called Eddie Shah who 3 years earlier had tried to smash the print unions in Manchester. And he had, I think it was a newspaper called the Warrington Messenger or something like that. And I remember there were huge protests about all of that. But it was Murdoch who really transformed the landscape. And arguably, the professionalisation had to happen at some time. And if it hadn't been Murdoch who had driven that forward, it would have been someone else. I think it is the political power of Murdoch that is the thing that this kind of counter the what if question gets at. We've had in British newspaper history, the Beaver Brooks and all the others who have been very powerful, Rothermere's, who have been very powerful newspaper magnates and have been prepared to use their political power. What I think Murdoch did was ally the technology with popular journalism, and we could go through a list of the Sun front pages, Up Yours the Laws, Gotcha, when the Belgrano was sunk.
The first one ever, first front page headline, horse dope sensation.
Yeah. But they had a power, these headlines, and so what he did was he harnessed the new technology, made it very affordable. It was at that stage, every day was a page 3 girl on, a topless young woman for everyone's titillation, and
You had to use the word titillation.
yeah, and a very good sports coverage as well, and it transformed the industry. So there was a tick in some ways that you could give Murdoch for having transformed it, but then you saw the political power he wielded within Whitehall.
But I suppose the question is that, like, to take it to the what if, how would Britain be different today if he hadn't bought it? If he didn't have that political power? Would someone else just have become a magnate in that way? Or was he a kind of uniquely historical figure at that time who had a particular agenda that would not have been replicated by someone else? And if so, how would British political culture have been significantly different? Because then I suppose that gets to the question of how important the press actually is, right? Or is it just reflective of wider trends?
Well, in the early years, Murdoch was very pro-Labour Party. He advocated a vote for the Labour Party by Howard Wilson in 1970. His headline was "Why It Must Be Labour." So he was always starting to dictate, to some extent, the direction that he wanted the electorate to go in if they read The Sun. So, I mean...
I think the thing about Murdoch is, I mean, look, he had, John Major tells the story of when, Murdoch came to see him in Downing Street and said, unless you do this over Europe, we are not going to back you in the next election. And sure enough, Kelvin Mackenzie, the editor, when he rang John Major up to say, we're not supporting you in the 97 election, he went further and said, I've got 2 buckets of shit and we're going to pour them both over your head tomorrow in the paper. Which was Kelvin Mackenzie's way of being the enforcer for Rupert Murdoch.
We should say that it's hard to mention Kelvin Mackenzie's name without saying that he did something far more egregious than talk about the buckets of shit. He was the editor that, during the Hillsborough tragedy, was quick to throw the blame on the Liverpoolians, the people of Liverpool, which is, why people in Liverpool still don't buy The Sun now.
And I think the Hillsborough example is probably quite a good microcosm of probably how Murdoch is unique, right? In the sense that that would not have happened without a certain culture of journalism existing, which was demotic, which was openly kind of like sort of trying to do a newspaper in a particular way, which I think was kind of unique to him. I mean, that's not to say that Murdoch didn't do good things for journalism, because he did. This is the other side of it, right? Which is that it's true to say he is a newspaper man to his fingertips. He bought the Times, bought the Sunday Times, very controversial at the time. And indeed, it's a good example of how embedded he was with Thatcher and the Thatcher government, that Thatcher basically overrode a load of competition law to allow Rupert Murdoch to buy those titles in a way that, many people opposed at the time, not least the former Prime Minister Jim Callaghan at the time. But I think that there is just such a kind of yin and yang to the kind of Murdoch legacy, right? There is, you can see that something like Hillsborough and that kind of deeply kind of brusque crudeness, which was very, very popular and successful, you get that, and you get a sort of legacy within the media which is, I think, unique to him.
There was also a social conservatism which was kind of often quite ugly. It was very anti-gay. Speak to some of the people who were done over by The Sun just because they were homosexual. I mean, I remember that...
Well, it put sex right at the centre of the paper, didn't it? It had assumed that all its readers were essentially obsessed with sex, and that if it wasn't talking about sex, then its readers were feeling left out.
When there was gay marriage and Elton John got married to David Furness, do you remember what the headline was in The Sun?
No.
Elton takes David up the aisle. Fwah, fwah, fwah. I mean, it was kind of playing for humour, but also it was a gay sex joke. And so some of that was really ugly. But I think that assessing Murdoch's legacy, I agree with you, Lewis. I think he is a uniquely interesting figure, and I think he drove massive change in the industry. And also, if you look at, him going into satellite television when he launched Sky.
Or the Premiership.
Exactly. Then you would watch Match of the Day or World of Sport highlights, and they would be 2 cameras at the ground, and there'd be a top shot and there'd be a ground level shot. The coverage was shit.
Yeah, I'd be lucky if you saw
Murdoch has absolutely transformed the way we watch sport. Sky News didn't exist. There was no 24-hour news service in the UK before Sky came along.
But would he have done that without him buying the Sun and the News of the World?
Well, I think
it gave him a foothold, didn't it?
Yeah, it gave him a foothold in the British media.
I mean, what we don't
and he
know
was a
is-
gambler. I mean, this
Yeah.
is an entrepreneur, and I think that actually his political views were secondary to his desire to make money.
Of course.
Deporting-
Labour one time, Tories the next, into Europe, out of Europe.
It just depends what
Of
serves
course.
his business interest best
But
at
I do
that time.
think, okay, so just going back to your point about scandal, because there was a time in the 80s and 90s where it felt like minister after minister was being brought down. Think how many lives. I mean, actually, we know how many lives were ruined through stuff like phone hacking, right? Because they are still paying out. They're still paying out millions of pounds to this day in people who have come to make, phone hacking claims. But even if you take that aside, which was, I think, a proven crime, even if you take that aside, you've got all the scandals that they did get right that were still utterly transformative and destructive of people's own lives. I mean, take somebody like Sophie Wessex, right? Who, when she first got married, one of the first stings was the fake shake. This was the News of the World thing rather than the Sun, but let's kind of amalgamate them. Who came in and sort of did an expose of her and her PR company, and she basically never worked in that industry again. She became the royal wife from that point onwards, and that's just a tiny, tiny example of the people whose lives were absolutely destroyed, turned upside down, cut through the middle by the kind of journalism that the Sun affected and the News of the World affected.
I kind of think when we think about Murdoch's power, and again it goes to the heart of this counterfactual about how Britain might have been different, I think we sometimes focus too much on election results. We say, obviously the most famous one was the Sun claiming in 1992
Somewhat
won it, which most academics and historians would say was not true. And that's usually the case, is that, generally speaking, Murdoch would go where he thought the winner was. That's what he did with 97. Blair was going to win that with or without the Sun. That was going to happen.
But the efforts that Blair and Campbell went to get him on side.
Which tells you something, and tells you something about his power. But
you don't want him against you, that's for sure.
Exactly. And I think that, but I think in a way, the way he's been more transformative than swinging election results or changing election results. Partly, as you say, John, because he's had such a big impact on the kind of wider media entertainment landscape, which I think is unique to him. But I think it's also about kind of a more subtle thing. It's about the sort of, it's kind of like the culture, the media culture of Britain and culture overall. It's like the slow drumbeat of how it affects our politics. So I think Murdoch's role, for example, in the slow legitimisation of Euroscepticism in Britain is a big thing. It is a big thing. In 1973, the Sun, when we joined the EEC, the Sun's headline is Happy New Europe. In the 1990s, under the editorship of Calvin Mackenzie, and slowly over time, turns to Euroscepticism, and it becomes helps it move away from being a fringe issue and to the heart of, in particular, conservative politics. So I think his big influence has been changes in our entertainment media generally, sort of slow political, cultural changes over time. And I think making our media more, for want of a better expression, and our paper culture, a lot more raucous than it would have been.
He's also a Republican, but he never managed to turn the British people off the royal family.
Well, he hates
the Australian people.
He hates sort of in privilege, right? In established privilege, he thinks that they're patronising. It's really interesting. It's why I never warmed to Cameron very much, right?
In a moment, we'll be back talking about that on-mic moment between Gordon Brown and Sue, who he blamed after his visit to Mrs. Duffy.
That was a disaster. Well, just... Okay. Should never have put me with that woman. Whose idea was that?
I don't know, I didn't see.
It's Sue, I think. They're just ridiculous.
I'm not sure they'll go with that one.
They will go with it.
What did she say?
Oh, everything. She's just a sort of bigoted woman. Said she used to be Labour. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
So I remember exactly where I was when I heard that clip, because it was the day of the television debate of the election campaign of 2010, and it was between the three leaders, and Gordon Brown had been to visit Gillian Duffy, and they'd had a row about immigration.
In Rochdale.
In Rochdale, which was, I seem to remember, a Labour seat that was being redrawn by boundaries to become a Lib Dem seat. So in other words, it became quite marginal at that point. And it ended with him calling her a bigoted woman, and the whole thing exploded. We were all sort of, everyone who was covering the campaign was out on the road, and Gordon Brown went into a studio with Jeremy Vine. Do you remember this?
Yeah.
And just because he couldn't hear very well, he was covering his ears to try and concentrate on the clip that was being played to him, and it looked, when he saw the clip, as if he had his head in his hands and he was going, I fucked that one up royally. I've done the worst thing you can ever do. I've insulted the voter. I've insulted the electorate. And it didn't make any difference.
And he had to go back and spend the whole afternoon with her.
It was so
canvassing
thick of
one
it.
vote.
It was the most thick of it thing that could ever have happened.
No, there is another thick of it
Go
thing
on.
that's happened. That when they got to BBC Leeds,
Yeah.
they realised that they've been caught on a hot mic, and they asked to go into a room where they can have a planning meeting and a conversation about what to do next. And one of the people who I know who was in that room suddenly sees that there is a camera. There's a closed circuit camera for security, and they don't know whether it's on or off. They smashed the camera.
No.
They got onto a table and smashed. So
Your licence fee, everyone. That's your licence fee in Leeds.
In answer to the what if question, the BBC wouldn't have had to spend money to put in a new closed circuit camera in that room.
Leak that? Why didn't they report? I mean,
because the BBC then would have put itself in the middle of the debate,
election campaign,
because they couldn't be sure whether this
Prime
camera was
Minister's
on
team
or
commits
off.
vandalism.
And Prime Minister's team commits an act of vandalism on BBC premises.
So the biggest story was 2010 was the election. It's the only election that Gordon Brown fought. He was Prime Minister because he'd kind of inherited the mantle from Tony Blair, and everyone was watching this Rochdale seat to say, oh, is this going to be the beginning of the end of it? As it turns out, he won Rochdale, but he lost the election.
Yeah.
And that was then when we saw David Cameron in coalition with Nick Clegg. But I guess the question really is, if that hadn't been the prevailing attitude towards people raising questions about immigration, would the whole story have been different? Would Gillian Duffy have been the Cassandra of everyone going, oh, blimey, people really care about immigration?
Well, I mean, even, the funny thing is that Mrs. Duffy herself ended up voting for Labour in that election. And, maybe she just as well, given Gordon Brown's had to spend so much time canvassing her personally.
It was a well-earned vote.
But I think, yeah, exactly. But it is, I mean, look, obviously, I don't think, the truth is that the 2010 election was a bit like the election we've just had, which is that everyone kind of knew Labour was going to lose. In fact, Labour was just so relieved. They couldn't believe that it was a hung parliament, that they lost quite well. And so, if Mrs. Duffy had happened, I don't think it would have made it any difference. But it's very, very little difference. But in a way, when I look back at that now, I almost think like it's almost the start of the political era that we're in. There's just something about the chaos of it. I think it was one of the first sort of proper Twitter moments as well, or sort of earlier real proper social media moment at least. It felt like the kind of utter chaos, or the thickification basically of kind of sort of politics on an ongoing basis. It felt like it was just like a harbinger, a bit like harbinger of two things, Emily. Like what you were saying about this debate which that kicked off about. It's quite a populist moment in a way, right?
It is. That's what
real,
I mean. He called her bigoted, and she's going, I'm just talking to you about immigration. There probably wasn't a lot of immigration in Rochdale, right, in 2010. But that wasn't the point. The point is that she thought there was, and he needed to address that.
Yeah, and so it was really indicative of that debate which was going to dominate, or that type of politics which would dominate our politics for year after year after year afterwards, but also that kind of just frenetic political chaos that we've all come to quite enjoy.
Look at the part that Rochdale played in the last election, where, do you remember, we had that became the Galloway seat, that became the Aziz seat. Yeah. Something's always
Cyril Smith's seat. God.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, what if this podcast went on for an hour?
It doesn't.
We're out of here. We'll see you
Merry
next
Christmas.
time. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.